This talk, Punishment, the Making of War Ethics in Modern Japan, is part of a larger project that Baran has already mentioned, an ambitious and I would even say a dangerous book project named Punishment Behind Japanese Military Brutality. And I would like to first introduce the outline of this bigger project, which the talk you'll hear today is the introductory part, I would say, or the first part of this large project. What I'm trying to do in this project is to solve a riddle, which, in my opinion, it's not completely solved by current research. Why was the Japanese army so brutal in World War II? And if we compare it to other powers, even totalitarian powers, it would be hard to say, let's say, that Japan was more brutal than Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. But at least I would say in the way it handled not war but occupation, it was certainly more brutal than Western armies of the period, and I would even say, and this is very crucial, it was more brutal than the behavior of the Japanese army in prior wars. So phenomena like the Nanjing Massacre, like the Manila Massacre, Unit 731, the Bataan Death March, and numerous other atrocities, including mass rapes, all over Asia, are enough of an important phenomenon to warrant scholarly discussion as for the why. And I would say that when we ask the why question, there are two groups of answers in historical scholarship with many variations. One group of answers, which is more common in pop literature, popular histories of all sorts, is that the Japanese were brutal due to essentialist reasons. Their martial culture or the culture in general had this ingrained theme of brutality. Some of the popular authors try to ascribe it to Bushido, which is a problematic explanation, as Bushido is an invented tradition from the late 19th century, but we'll leave it aside for a moment, or to kind of other traits in Japanese warrior culture. Maybe the best or the worst example of this kind of literature is the last book by Brian Mark Rigg, Japan's Holocaust. And this argument is problematic, first of all, because it tends to be circular. Why the Japanese army was brutal? Because Japanese martial culture was brutal. Why was Japanese martial culture brutal? Because the Japanese army was brutal. Usually tends to go in a circle. But the biggest problem is that the Japanese army behaved much more moderately in Meiji wars, in prior wars. In the First Sino-Japanese War, in the Russo-Japanese War, in the First World War, um, the Japanese army was never a benevolent institution. I don't want to create this impression. But it was more or less like other armies of empires in the period, sometimes even more restrained, depends on the war. And it was certainly not as brutal as it was in World War II. I think nobody really claims that. So if you ascribe World War II brutality to essential features like Bushido, like emperor worship, like the emperor system, Tennosei, like ingrained racism towards other Asians, all explanations which are in a way essential to Japanese military and political culture, you have to ask what happened in the Meiji period. Weren't the Japanese, I'm putting it in quote, worshipping the emperor also in the Meiji period? Wasn't Bushido also back then? Were they not racist towards other Asians also in Meiji War? So why the change? These explanations cannot account for the change in the 1930s and the 1940s. In order to solve this problem, there is a kind of a second group of explanations, usually offered by professional academic historians. And these explanations tend to focus in contingencies of the 1930s and the 1940s. often of the Second World War itself. So, and there are multiple explanations. The most popular one, you could see it in the excellent new book by Sarah Kovner, Prisoners of the Empire, on Japan's World War II prisoner, POW policy, bad logistics. The Japanese had terrible logistics in the Second Sino-Japanese War and in the Second World War. And if you have bad logistics, then of course you wouldn't feed prisoners, and it's much easier to murder prisoners. And that explains many of these war crimes. And this is only one explanation. Others say a culture of drunkenness, racism, which was specific to the period, a total war, many other explanations, which what unites between these explanations is the contingency. They are contingent on the 1930s and the 1940s. But again, even this group of explanations run into a very interesting problem. Because if you examine with a critical eye the so-called good wars of Japan in the Meiji period, the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, and in a way even the First World War, you may find atrocities which are very similar in structure and dynamics to the atrocities of the 1930s. Maybe the most conspicuous example, which I study in detail in my work, is the Port Arthur massacre of November 1894 in the First Sino-Japanese War. I would not say that it's identical to the Nanjing massacre. There are many differences. Most importantly, in the Port Arthur massacre, very few women and children were killed. It was mainly a massacre of men. And in Nanjing, more women and children were killed. But the dynamics otherwise are very similar, especially that the main excuse for the massacre was that many of the Chinese were actually hidden soldiers. And this explanation will repeat itself in 1937 in Nanjing. So you need to ask yourself, if the explanation is contingencies of the 1930s and the 1940s, so how do you account for the continuity? Again, these massacres in the Meiji period, and there were atrocities in the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War, especially in Siberia as well, but they were in the midst of much more restrained behavior. So my conclusion is that in order to solve our riddle, you need to account for both continuity and change. And in order to do this, you need to write a non-essentialist, longue-durée history of Japanese war ethics. More specifically, treatment of enemy civilians and POWs. I limit myself mostly to that. I don't deal much with occupation policy, for example. I deal with usually wartime treatment of enemy civilians and POWs. In this specific talk, we focus on the Meiji era. My work, of course, deals with the later periods in great detail. Just a second. Okay. And in order to solve our question and to frame this longue-durée history properly, we need to go to some basics, some theoretical basics. In modern IHL, International Humanitarian Law and the Laws of War, the principle of distinction, so-called, is a very major principle. It means you are not allowed to kill civilians intentionally during war. I mean, also for today, I speak kind of contemporary, but you are allowed to kill combatants. Of course, this is way more complicated. There are many, many exceptions, but this is the general rule. What I'm trying to argue is that unlike my colleagues who study international law, and I piss them off quite often, because what I'm trying to do is to historicize international law. International jurists tend to assume, like Catholic theologians, that international law is a kind of a universal given. And the discussion should be whether X or Y or Z applies the law correctly or not. But I'm saying that the principle of distinction, which is common today, you may kill combatants but not civilians, was created under very specific historical circumstances in the Western world, and this is not the only principle of distinction possible. On the other hand, In almost any culture in history, there is some kind of principle of distinction in wartime. When you ask or you inquire after combatants in different cultures and periods throughout history, and you ask, whom is it legitimate to kill in wartime? The answer is very rarely everyone always. Usually there is some kind of distinction, but it does not necessarily pass between combatants and non-combatants, like the AHL we know today. And what I'm interested in is what happened in Japan in the 1870s in a period which I named the Meiji encounter. During the Meiji period, I would like to argue, Japan, or Japanese important actors in the military scene, had their own ideas about whom it is legitimate to kill in war or not, which were based on a very rich Sino-Japanese tradition of war ethics. In the West, there were different ideas which started to crystallize at the time as international law, which was the conventions were not signed yet, most of them, but the ideas were already there. What I would not like to do here is to be essentialist. I'm very careful of it. I don't argue that China Western foreign advisors who influenced the Japanese army, there were very distinct sets of ideas. So what I would name for the sake of convenience, the Sino-Japanese idea or the Japanese idea, these are specific ideas which were dominant in Japan, China, and the West at the time of the Meiji encounter. But of course, they developed long beforehand as dominant ideas, though they were never the only ones. During the Meiji encounter, Japanese policymakers, much like their Qing counterparts, had a certain set of dominant ideas on war ethics. One is the idea that I call universal authority. While few people deluded themselves that the emperor or whoever speaks in his name actually ruled the entire world, the idea was that the legitimate authority in principle, in idea, should be universal. And it should be universal in the sense that it established justice, impartiality, benevolence, good governance, many different terms, through the entire realm. Tenka, Tianxia in Chinese, and usually the line passed between public and private interests. In Tokugawa, Japan, for example, this idea was very pronounced that only the central government, the shogun, who is of course appointed by the emperor, represents the kogi, represents the public interest of all, while being selfish, working for private interests only, was considered negative. Public violence is justified, private violence is not. Of course, both the history of China and Japan at the time and before were full of private violent actors, but more often than not, many of them tried, if possible, to mask their violence as public. In the case of Sengoku Japan, that was often done by making alliances with someone from the central court or from the shogunal court. And the idea was, and this is the key idea, that war is criminal enforcement. That's what I really want to emphasize. War for the public interest is enforcement of the law on criminals. And the rhetoric is always a rhetoric of punishment. Punish your enemies, quoting, for example, Zhuo Zongtang from famous general statesman of the Qing dynasty on Muslim rebels. If we cannot soothe them, then we must punish them. This is from the new biography of Kenneth Swart. When you look on more ancient periods in China and you see wars, for example, against the Xiongnu during the Han Dynasty, punish or subjugate your enemies is a rhetoric which is repeating itself throughout history in both China and Japan. Punishment is collective in nature. Usually, you don't punish only the individuals who are responsible for the rebellion, but you can punish entire groups. What is the scope of the collective punishment? That depends. For example, the Emperor Qianlong very famously ordered to exterminate the entire Jungar Mongol nation as a punishment for what he saw as a rebellion. The enemy is a criminal. And there is no difference between rebel, which is the same word in a way in classical Chinese. I'm speaking of Zay, and an external enemy. In that sense, it does not matter whether the enemy is armed or not, right? Combatants, civilians, all of its definitions, you punish culprits. So what matters is whether they are guilty of the rebellion in a collective or private sense or not. There is often a way out. And this way out is a very interesting ritual, which in the book I study very closely, which in Japanese is called shazai or kijun, which means repentance, submission, returning your allegiance to the rightful sovereign. At the absolute minimum, you need to prostrate before the emperor, uh, apologize for your wrong deeds, and reaffirm the structure of authority that you violated. It must include self-abasement of some form, and the imperial commander can decide whether to accept the apology or not accept the apology. We all know the case of Li Hongzhang during the Taiping Rebellion, who executed rebels who surrendered because they were impudent in his opinion or because he just wanted to kill them. But this is what I want to emphasize. Shazai, Kijun, this is not a contract. They do not surrender in return for clemency. Clemency is never promised. Clemency is a grace. And the imperial commander could revoke this grace later if he wants. In the case of Japan, this was not always the only way to surrender. In the Sengoku period, for example, there were almost equal peace agreements between belligerents, especially if you didn't want to alienate the other side later. But during the early Meiji period, when the state wanted to establish the absolute monopoly of imperial authority on power, on political power, the idea of punishment that existed in the past side by side with other ideas, like the peace agreement from the Sengoku period that I just mentioned, uh, it became distilled more than ever before. If I may use a metaphor from the world of alcohol, it was beer and now it turned into whiskey. So in the early Meiji period, this idea of punishment and repentance as the only way to get out of punishment became stronger than ever before. My favorite example is the Saga Uprising from 1874, where the rebels, in order to ask for a clemency, had to admit that they betrayed the emperor and were robbers and rebels. And when they tried to write in the Shazai letter, in the submission letter, that were actually misunderstood imperial soldiers, the imperial government forced them to redraft and resubmit the letter. Because without self-abasement, it doesn't work. It defies the whole point. And even later, they punished the Saga rebels through certain categories according to how close they were to the ringleaders. In Western Europe, during the Meiji encounter, by contrast, there were very different ideas of war ethics that began to develop very gradually throughout the Middle Ages. If you go to late antiquity, to the ideas of St. Augustine, then they are very, very similar to the idea I just described from China and Japan. There is only one legitimate authority, which is the Christian Roman Empire, and war is a punishment for transgressors, and all other kinds of war are forbidden. The problem is that throughout the Middle Ages, the idea of universal authority in the West did not disappear only in practice. It was the case also in China and Japan in many periods. It disappeared also as an ideal. This disappearance was very, very gradual because many people throughout the Middle Ages believed that, for example, either the Pope or the Emperor are the sole arbiters of legitimate authority, but gradually, independent kings started to claim their own authority. I can expand on it in a Q&A. It was a fascinating and very complicated process. And medieval jurists divided wars to several categories. If a war is legitimate, that is, God is on your side, when you're fighting infidels, for example, or barbarians or other categories, rebels, non-state actors, peasant rebellions, many, many examples, the wars are mortal. There are no rules. You punish rebels, very similar to the idea of punishment that I described in China and Japan. What I'm trying to say is that these traditions do not contradict each other and are not mutually exclusive. They are different, in some ways similar in other ways, but gradually, the wars, when you are certain that God supports legitimate authority, according to medieval Jews, are mortal wars. In mortal wars, guerre mortelle, that was the French term often used, or a bellum Romanum, a Roman wars, that was the same thing, there are no rules and no restraints because this is again a war punishment. But sometimes there are wars when you don't know whom God supports. And this is often the case of wars between legitimate Christian kings. And in such wars, and the category came from Germanic jurisprudence originally, it's a very, very interesting story how it developed. Because you don't know whom God supports, there are certain rules which limit the war. For example, you shouldn't kill women, children, priests, and several other professional categories. This is changing between different jurists. Usually, women, children, and priests are the most persistent categories, which has protections. You take prisoners for ransom in the beginning only knights, but then it's gradually expanding also to warriors from lower classes, mostly in the early modern period. This category of limited war forms the basis of what we know now as Western international law, or international humanitarian law as it is known today. Many people go the 19th century for the roots of Western international law. I argue that you need to go to the Middle Ages. Otherwise, you don't understand many things. Why, for example, women are more protected than men. This goes back to certain chivalric ideas. Uh, in medieval Europe, when you wanted to show your enemy whether you go to a mortal war or limited war, you went with a different flag. If you wanted to go to a mortal war, you went with a black flag or a red flag. This is, as my colleague Ziv Borer had shown in his studies, the origin of the famous pirate flag. This kind of black flag, the skull and bones, this is a later adornment. The black flag, in a way, is a way to show that the pirates are fighting a mortal war. POW's protection and protection for unarmed civilians are direct consequences of the principle of limited war. In the words of the St. Petersburg Convention from 1868, one of the earliest European international law conventions, redundant cruelty is prohibited, and the only violence which is allowed is violence designed to weaken the military forces of the enemy. Pay attention to the philosophical basic assumptions behind it. As war or limited war is considered a legitimate contest between legitimate sovereigns, it's like an athletic game in a sense. So you're allowed to kill whoever disturbs victory. But you are not allowed to kill people who don't interfere with your victory. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense not to kill women, children, POWs, wounded enemies, because they don't no longer stand between you and victory. Of course, these principles did not always apply in practice, as we know that Western countries perpetrated numerous atrocities everywhere, and certainly not for everybody. As we'll see in a minute, barbarians, non-state actors, savages, so-called non-European countries, rebels, the rules don't always apply. But this is the basic idea. And where push comes to shove, I made the following table to kind of map the different ideas that encountered one another during the 1870s in the moment of the Meiji encounter. Underlying political philosophy in Japan, it is universal rule, or at least exclusive legitimacy. When the emperor is fight somebody else, the enemy is illegitimate. Western international law at the time assumed equally legitimate sovereigns, at least within the West. Outside the West, it was debated. The dominant principle of distinction in the West, in Japan, it was innocent and guilty. Are you innocent of the rebellion or are you guilty of the rebellion? Remember, it's also a group definition, not a individual necessarily. How close you are to the core of the ringleaders of the rebellion. In the Saga rebellion that I mentioned, Saga Uprising, 1874, that's a classic example. The European rule is armed against unarmed. Again, because the idea is who disturbs your victory, not who is guilty or innocent. Think about it. I always tell my students when I teach it, think about executing a serial killer in countries where there is still capital punishment. When you execute a serial killer, you don't care whether he's armed or not during the execution, right? It's beside the point. You execute him because he's guilty. That's why the concept that you cannot kill people who are unarmed was very weird to Japanese officers in the Meiji period. Applicability. In the Meiji case, the applicability is uniform. As I said before, enemies are illegitimate, rebels, bandits, barbarians, enemies of the court, call it as you will. There is no real difference between an internal war and between an external war, and at least this difference was not really clear. How much it was not clear, let me give you an example. When international law started to arrive in Japan in the late Edo period, there was actually a debate between Japanese intellectuals who tried to make sense of it and understand what it is, whether it applies in wars between Hans, between domains in Japan or not. It was not really clear that war between domains was different of war between countries. Especially if you read the last book by Luke Roberts, Performing the Great Peace, you know the domains hold itself countries, kuni. So it was really, really murky. Influential discourse, the debate around war ethics, in the Meiji case, as in Qing China, the debate was around the center. Intellectuals who are close to the imperial court and help to fashion public policy. Here I come to a crucial point. Because in the West, there was no agreed leader or anyone who was kind of thought as universal, having universal authority in the 19th century, the debate was public. And the debate was public between intellectuals, jurists, journalists, officers in different countries who spoke different languages. Of course, they shared cultural assumptions with one another, but they had to convince one another. So when you fought a war, it was very, very important to prove that you played by the rules and you needed to convince. That's why what I call the foreign gaze, what foreigners think about what you're doing, was very, very crucial in debates of Western international law. And of course, it took the Meiji Japanese a very short time to understand the importance of the foreign gaze. And last but not least, importance of gender. In the principle of punishment, as far as I saw in my research, both in Qing China and Meiji Japan, and actually before it as well, there was no real importance to gender because the question is whether the person in question is guilty or no. Age sometimes was important. In China and Japan, some people say that children, for example, should be pardoned more easily, or old people, because we are not really guilty. But women and men, why? Why there is a difference? Chivalric tradition in the West dictated better protections for women. Just give you the example how important it is even today, because traditions are sticky. In another research project I'm doing, I'm also engaged in research of the current war in Gaza. And one of the things which immediately stood before my eyes, that both Israel, Hamas, and the various mediators share the basic assumptions that women should be released first in hostage deals, even female soldiers. You cannot understand it without going back to this chivalric tradition which framed Western basic assumptions. Now, in the Meiji period, there were several factors at play. The officers who managed affairs in the Meiji army were still very much people of the Edo period. That's where they were educated, that's where their ideas came from, and they clearly had traditional punishment views. Again, you saw it after the Saga uprising, where the severed heads of the leaders of the uprising were displayed in Tokyo. This is a traditional practice of punishing rebels, and the Meiji leaders didn't even understand what's wrong with it. And on the other end, there was an increasing influence of Western international law through diplomatic engagement and through a small group of influential foreign advisors. And this is a crucial point because though Western tradition is rich and complicated and almost everything was debated within the West, the most important thing if you want to understand the Meiji encounter is what a specific small number of foreign advisors told the Japanese army about international law. There was an idea that Japan should be considered civilized by the West because the Meiji regime wanted to revise the unequal treaties and it had to bypass what they called back then the standard of civilization. And part of it was fighting according to Western international law. So what foreign advisors said, the foreign gain was very, very important. In practice, as I show in my research, punishment and Western distinction, kind of traditional views of punishment, and Western ideas of distinction intermixed throughout the Meiji era. I do not want to argue, and I want to be crystal clear about it, that because I know that people will blame me in the Q&A, it always happens, that I argue that Western tradition was lenient, kind of enlightened Western international law, and Japanese tradition was, Sino-Japanese tradition of punishment was a brutal tradition of chopping off heads. No, actually both traditions, as I'll show in a moment, could be cruel and could be lenient depending on circumstances. And often they very much intermixed with one another in Meiji military thought. Saga Rebellion, as I mentioned, this is an example of punishment pure and simple. Without yet an influence of Western international law, here you see the chopped off head of Eto Shinpei, one of the leaders of the rebellion, which was not only, placed in Tokyo, but visitors to the office of the Japanese foreign minister, I'm using minister, though titles at the time were different, he put a broadside of this picture of his chopped off in his office for all of his visitors to see. So this is an example of traditional principles at play. But very quickly, even at the same year, 1874, they already started to intermix. In 1874, Japan is invading southwestern Taiwan, what we call in Japanese the Taiwan Shupei or the Mudan Jiken, the Mudan Incident. Aborigines from southwestern Taiwan kill castaways from the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is considered by Japan to be a dependency. And the Japanese decide in a very kind of traditional fashion to make a punitive expedition. And if you read the formal documents of the expedition, you see that they are couched in traditional punishment terms. They could have been written in the 16th century. Nobody would have recognized the difference. Saigo Tsugumichi, the supreme commander of the expedition, gets an order. You are hereby ordered to investigate the incidents, inflict punishments, and distribute rewards according to the results of your investigation. If compensations are not forthcoming, you should punish the guilty parties. Think of this document. This is a document of criminal enforcement. It could be written for criminal enforcement inside Japan, for that matter. And the rhetoric is very exterminatory. The idea is that if they don't go through the traditional ritual of Kijun Shazai, the entire tribe should be exterminated as a punishment. But during the expedition, something very interesting happens. The foreign advisors of Japan gradually begin to protest against customs which they see as barbarian, especially collecting heads, as of course pre-modern warriors in Japan used to do. And the commander of the expedition, Saigo Tsugumichi, is very afraid of, I'm quoting, bringing the ridicule of foreigners upon ourselves. Think about the foreign gaze and see how it's working. And in an amazing scene, in my opinion, from the expedition, the samurai volunteers from Tosa, actually, bring chop-off heads to Saigo Tsugumichi as they are used to do. That's how you show achievements in pre-modern martial culture. Saigo Tsugumichi is about to accept the heads, and then his foreign advisors rebukes him for, I'm quoting, this terrible barbaric custom. And what Saigo is doing is reprimanding his samurai immediately. What are you doing? Why are you behaving like barbarians? And it takes an instant, and we are astounded. And from that moment, it stops. And then another foreign advisor, a French advisor, Boissonade, who's very influential at the time, recommends the Meiji government not to kill women and children and old people. See, kind of the Western principles at play. And what Saigo Tsugumichi is doing is something which is very sophisticated. He also wants to get out of Taiwan for different reasons, especially tropical diseases, which are widespread within the Japanese army. So what he's making is calling the representatives of the indigenous tribes and arranging a very quick ritual of surrender, Hijun Shazai, as in the traditional way, and using it as a way to avoid the massacre that he should have perpetrated according to his previous proclamations. So this is a very interesting intermix between Western advice and traditional ideas in the same campaign. I want to emphasize here that Saigo Tsugumichi knew very little about Western international law at the time. But he had foreign advisors who told him what is civilized, what is barbarian, and he was very, very careful about their opinion. We are passing a few years into the future, to the first Sino-Japanese War, and this is, I would say, Japan's epoch or high point or beginning of the high point of the adoption of Western international law in the Japanese army. There are manuals of the rules of war in the Japanese army. There are proclamations of the emperor and of individual commanders, from high commanders to mid-ranking commanders, that the Japanese army should not kill POWs, they should not kill wounded Chinese soldiers. Of course, they should not kill civilians. I'm quoting from the orders of Field Marshal Oyama Iwao, the commander-in-chief of the Second Army. Our enemies are the armed forces of Qing China, not the individuals of that country. Even the enemy soldiers, from the moment they become wounded, stop being our enemies, and we should treat them in kindness. This is not only Western international law. This is Western international law that somebody learned from the outside. These are distilled principles, because in the West we are way more murky, debated, mixed with other things. Here, it's like many of us, of course, had the experience of learning Japanese as a foreign language. I'm sure that you all remember this phenomenon that when you speak in Japan, people tell you, so ryugakusei no Nihongo. This is like a Japanese of foreign students. Because when you learn a language, you learn to speak it correctly. And of course, the speech of native speakers is much more kind of intermixed. It's the same idea with learning legal ideas from the outside. And yet, during this period, the Japanese army is mostly restrained during the Sino-Japanese War. But there is at least one episode of a really disgusting massacre of several thousands of Chinese civilians, again in November 1894 in the port city of Port Arthur. The immediate catalyst of this massacre is mutilation of Japanese dead bodies by the Qing soldiers. And then the Japanese commanders, who have their legal advisors, begin to understand that their soldiers are very frustrated. They want revenge because of these really terrible mutilations. I should mention, by the way, that the Qing Chinese army did not take prisoners at all. Japanese prisoners were mostly murdered on the spot. But in Port Arthur, they were also mutilated, and this brought a lot of fury. And the commanders and their legal advisors began to think which outlets do they have to whitewash the violence of their soldiers according to Western international law. Western international law, and it's very, very important to emphasize here, developed around the core, which was very solid, and a periphery, which was very ambiguous. As you may remember, POW rights began limited to Christian knights, and they expanded to rank and file soldiers, and then gradually to non-Christians. And in the 19th century, the solid core was state soldiers of European Western armies. Anything beyond that, non-state actors, rebels, non-Western armies, that was always debated. It was an ambiguous periphery, and the Japanese understood it. And they said, okay, in Port Arthur, the civilians are not really civilians because this is the military-industrial complex. And the soldiers don't really fight fairly. They shoot from houses, from civilian houses, which is forbidden according to Western international law. They fight without uniforms, which is the crime of perfidy. And therefore, they forego their protections under international law. In a way, Saigo Tsugumichi during the Taiwan expedition was more careful about the life of local civilians because he didn't know much about Western international law. And he was very, very careful not to offend his Western advisors. The Japanese commanders in Port Arthur knew a lot about international law. And therefore, they knew that we have many loopholes and outlets how to whitewash a massacre. This is just what I intended when I said that the tradition of punishment could be lenient and the tradition of international Western international law could be cruel, depends on the circumstances. And the comparison between the Taiwan expedition and the Port Arthur massacre shows us the difference. And yet I want to emphasize, in Port Arthur, the Japanese still have limits. Women were usually not killed, and little children, though some were. And most of all, usually the behavior of the Japanese army was quite restrained. During this war, this was an aberration. So it could not be compared in a way to what happened later during the second Sino-Japanese war. Just a second. And now I want to kind of give some kind of a conclusion, but this conclusion is actually opening my real research question. This talk in a way is only an introduction because we still didn't answer the question, what happened later? What accounted for the change of the 1930s? And I want to kind of put certain ideas on the table, and we may discuss it in the Q&A. During the Meiji period, there was a coexistence of principles. The principle of punishment and Western distinction coexisted. As I tried to show you, they were never mutually exclusive. So this coexistence was even more murky than, let's say, in a case where there were dichotomies. There were not. As we saw, Both could be either cruel or lenient in practice according to circumstances changed between wars, between circumstances and many decisions of individual commanders. And now I want to kind of put my main research question on the table, which kind of develops out of my talk today. My opinion as to the question what happened in the 1930s, and I hope that if you read my book, you will be convinced, I'll try to convince you at least, is that the process that unfolded since the Russo-Japanese War, and it unfolded gradually, is a process which I call the banditization of warfare. If you remember, Western international law gave solid protection to a certain core of people, that is, state soldiers of Western armies. And as you got further and further away from this core, the protections were more murky, debated, and sometimes non-existent. It was easier to massacre POWs from non-European countries, and even more easy if they were rebels or considered traitors, uh, and or enemies of humanities, or many other categories. What's important here is that the category of people which was least protected by Western international law were unlawful combatants, which were named bandits at the time. And when I say bandits, I don't mean only robbers in the criminal sense. Both in Europe and in China and Japan, bandits were very similar to what, let's say, George W. Bush would call unlawful combatants. And in principle, these categories bleed into one another. Because if you are a non-state warrior, you need to make your living from somewhere, right? You need to take resources, and you will take them from the local population. If the government is doing it, it is called taxation. If somebody who is not a government is doing it, it is called robbery. You can see it in the Second World War in Poland when there were different groups of partisans. Some belongs to the Polish government in exile, and some, let's say, Jewish partisans, which were informal. The Polish underground Armia Krajowa defined the Polish groups as doing legal taxation and the Jewish groups as doing banditry. They did the same thing, but one was official and one was not. That's what I'm trying to say, how bandits were defined. And since the Russo-Japanese War, Japan defined more and more of its enemies as bandits. Bandits were unprotected by Western international law. And because international law was silent about bandits, traditional views of punishment came back by default and began to be more and more dominant in the 1930s, but this time without the traditional outlet of the surrender ceremony, which was kind of, it was not gone by the 1930s. It still happened, but it was relatively rare. The reason that the Japanese defined more and more of their enemies as bandits was that since the First World War, they didn't really fight an organized army any longer. Their main enemies were armed groups, non-state armed groups in China and Russia. The turning point, and here I want to make the provocative argument, that racism was a very little part of the picture here. Because the Japanese first tried a bandit framework in a large scale against Russians during the Siberian intervention. Russian Bolshevik groups at the time called either bandits or radicals, kagekia, by the Japanese army. And gradually, the Japanese started to identify the Chinese national cause, just like the Korean national cause, with what they called banditry. And this identification became so solid in the 1930s that when the Japanese encountered the armies of the Kuomintang in the 1930s, even jurists did not define them as bandit armies. This was never an official definition. That's what soldiers and officers fought in the field. That was their framework. This was the frame of mind. And that's how the Nanjing massacre was actually perceived by its perpetrators, of a way of punishing bandits. What's interesting here is that The only distinction which made sense was between bandits and what the Japanese army called ryomin, the loyal subjects. And the definitions are often very arbitrary. And another thing which is interesting, and here I will end, is that when Japan fought the US Army during the Philippine campaign in 1942, nobody in Japan said that the American soldiers were bandits, because, this is a regular army of a Western state, but they were treated in a way like bandits according to the Japanese tradition, because the Japanese army was not trained to any other mode of warfare and any other mode of holding POWs, fighting so-called bandits, that just the only way the army knew and remembered how to fight. Thank you very much.